Let's get started. Okay, this is going to be a it's going to be something. All right, this is called the three schools of Jewish thought. I was going to do four, but then I realized that I needed more clarity on the fourth one, and also we wouldn't have enough time. So there is a possible fourth. Okay, and you could ask me about that, at some other point. And I have to give credit where credit is due. So this is based. It's not from, but it is based on a series of shiurim given by Rabbi Fox, who was my high school principal. It was a shiur he gave in the late 2000s, and it was recorded. And I only heard the first two shiurim, and I think the rest either weren't recorded or they got lost. So we're gonna go through three schools of Jewish thought. I heard the first and the second, and I didn't hear the third. Okay, which is the one I needed to hear the most. But the framework that he set up all comes from him. And then the particulars, I think, are mine. At this point, I can't remember what I got from him and what I didn't, but I'm pretty sure that this is the particulars are from me. So, you could blame me for anything that doesn't make sense. Okay, so term of the day is school of thought. Okay, what is a school of thought? A school of thought is, loosely speaking, according to the dictionary, a particular way of thinking. I think Wikipedia has a better definition. A school of thought or intellectual tradition is the perspective of a group of people who share common characteristics of opinion or outlook of a philosophy, discipline, belief, social movement, economics, cultural movement, or art movement. Loose way of thinking is, you could say, it's a trend in thinking. And an example, not having to do with Torah, would be in parenting. The old school of thought was that punishment should be used as a disciplinary tool, but newer schools of thought maintain that compassion and acceptance is more effective. So I'm using this as an example because, like, you could see how it's not just like one opinion, it's a whole way of thinking about the topic. So if your whole way of thinking about parenting has to do with like punishment, that's going to result in many, many different like ideas and practices. So it's like a larger way of thinking that encompasses many other ways of thinking. Okay, so objectives, limitations, and disclaimers. We got a lot of these. Okay, so number one, the goal here is to have a rough outline of three schools of Jewish thought. Okay, rationalism, traditionalism, and blind faith. Okay, and I'm going to say right away that I feel very conflicted about actually, I won't say right away. I'll say it later. The purpose of this is to give you a frame of reference for further investigation of the diverse approaches in each school. Meaning, I am not going to try to present everything in every school of thought. That's impossible, and I'm not going to try. The goal is for you to be aware that these are three schools of thought, and then to have a clear view of what you're investigating when you learn on your own. Three, specifically, the objective in providing a frame of reference is to make it easier for you to grasp what the Mefarshim are trying to do when they're writing, which differs based on what school of thought they're in, and also to understand why different Jews are drawn to different conclusions. What we're talking about here, even though we're gonna focus on Chachamim, like in like Rishonim and Achronim, this applies to like Jews on the street, and you'll find like different groups of Jews that are drawn in different ways. And I think having these schools of thought will help you to like categorize and process them. Ultimately, though, what's more important than the particular points I'm going to make and the particular questions I'm going to answer is just this way of thinking and having these questions in your mind. So that's kind of like the overall goal. Okay, now, a bunch of disclaimers. This is not intended to be regarded as a definitive, authoritative, comprehensive presentation of the schools, like I said before. Furthermore, I'm going to present these schools of thought as like exaggerated archetypes, meaning like, how in Mishle that we've learned together, we talk about like the Ksil and like the Chacham and the Navon and the Pesi. And in real life, there's no such thing as like someone who's purely a Chacham or someone who's purely a Ksil. But we're using like these exaggerated models because it's easier to understand the subtleties when you have like the black and white version. So I'm presenting this as a black and white version, but this will not be reflecting the shades of gray. And there are lots of shades of gray and overlaps. Similarly, think of these as like spectrums with different degrees. So for example, you're going to see rationalists and traditionalists. You could have people who are like a 4 on the rationalist scale, or a 9 or a 10, and same thing with traditionalists. Or you could have people who are like, rational traditionalists or traditional rationalists, the mix and match. Okay. Most important point is everything we say today is only about Jewish thought, which we're calling machshava, Jewish philosophy. You call it hashkafah. We're not at all talking about halacha. You should assume that all three schools of thought hold that halacha is binding. And similarly, when we talk about the Masorah or Jewish tradition, we're only talking about what I'm calling the Masoras HaMachshava, the tradition of Jewish thought. We're not talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh. We're not talking about halacha. Okay, so at no point in this year should you think that we are talking about anything having to do with halacha. Okay, and I'm saying that clearly because every year I've taught this, someone always like asks a question that sounds like, oh, so you mean that these people wouldn't keep halacha? No, I'm not saying that. Okay, we're not talking about halacha. We're only talking about Jewish thought. Also, I'm going to admit my biases. Okay, I don't think this should surprise any of you. Okay, that I would fall along the rationalist school. I'm going to try to present all three as objectively as possible, but I know that I'm not successful because I know that I'm biased. So, we learned in English that there's a straw man, where you make like a caricatured version of the other position and you attack it. And the opposite of that is a steel man, where you try to present the most accurate, best version of what they hold. I'm going to try my best to steel man the other two approaches, but I know that I am biased. So I thought it'd be better for me to let you know that I'm biased instead of like pretending that I'm not. And also, like I mentioned, my knowledge of the blind faith approach is very lacking. Number one, because blind faith, we'll see, is an approach that really developed very recently in Jewish history. And because my learning tends to be focused on the Rishonim, then I'm not familiar with that approach from them. And I also did not hear Rabbi Fox's high school shiur that he gave on this. He did give another shiur at YBT, which is available, but I need to review that before I can speak authoritatively on it. Okay.
Did you name them these
Yeah.
groups, or was that Rabbi Fox?
Say it one more time.
Did you name them these three names, or was it Rabbi Fox?
That was Rabbi Fox's names. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that now I can say what I regret. So I don't feel comfortable with labels. I think it tends to be bad to label people like rationalists and traditionalists. However, I can't deny that this is a helpful way of like thinking. So I don't use these labels in my own learning, but for the purposes of like introduction, I think it is like like kind of like I don't know, let's say like introverts and extroverts. Every person has like circumstances in which they have qualities of both, but like it is a useful category to talk about in black and whites. Okay, so what we're going to do is like this. For each school of thought, we're going to discuss the same items, which is examples of Jewish thinkers who are in that category. I'm going to lead with that just so you can have names in your head. Then we're going to talk about what they hold emuna is. And the reason why I'm choosing the word emuna is this is something that in Jewish thought, or Jewish, philosophy, everyone holds that you should strive to have emuna, okay? But there are radically different definitions of what type of emuna you're striving for, or how you know when you've got it. So we're going to say what their differences are. Then we're going to talk about what the goal is in studying Jewish thought. We are all studying Jewish thought. We do this, throughout high school. But the thing is, like, what are you aiming for? What is a Jewish thinker in terms of what you're trying to become? Okay. You're familiar with the phrase, like, when push comes to shove, like, like for example, like, this is, I'm trying to think of a non-emotionally charged example. Like let's say, for example, like, you have lots of possessions that you own, okay? But like if your house is on fire and you had to like save one thing, when push comes to shove, what are you actually going to save? So like when you're forced to like make a decision, what's going to happen? So when push comes to shove is going to try to show where these differences of schools of thought express themselves when they're in conflict. Okay. Then we're going to talk about their view of Gedolim, of like great people in Judaism, because they have different views. And then we're going to articulate how each school of thought would respond to the other school of thought. Okay. And that is the goal. Okay. That's the plan. And we got 35 minutes. Okay. So start with the rationalists. Okay. Rationalists, according to my understanding, and again, this is oversimplified. Okay. But I'm trying to be exaggerating here. Well, this is not an exaggeration. Notable rationalists: Rambam is viewed as the king of the rationalists. Ralbag is even more rationalistic than the Rambam, but he's just not as popular. Bahi ibn Pakuda, the author of the Chovos HaLevavos. Sadigon was the first one who wrote a rationalist book of Jewish thought. Ibn Ezra is a rationalist, and there are many more, but these are names you're familiar with. Okay. What's their definition of emuna? Is like, what would you say the Rambam, when the Rambam says have emuna in Hashem? What do you think that means? Actually, you could probably answer this because I feel like we've talked about this in the past. What would the Rambam say it means to have emuna in Hashem?
Knowledge of him, maybe?
Yeah, exactly, right? So rational conviction based on valid evidence and reasoning. Rational meaning that it must make sense, and based on evidence and reasoning meaning that it is logically, I mean, I guess maybe I don't need the word rational. I could just say conviction based on valid evidence and reasoning. You're convinced on the basis of knowledge, not on the basis of authority, and not on the basis of feeling. Okay, that's what you're trying to get. Now, what is our job as Jews who are trying to like understand Jewish philosophy? We are trying to understand, to know, understand, and verify everything with our own mind to the extent possible. Okay, now why is it important to say to the extent possible?
Because our mind is limited.
Because our mind is limited. Okay, now what do you mean when you say our mind is limited? Like, what would be an example of what you have in mind?
Like we're physical, so we can't really understand things which
Okay,
aren't.
so certain things are a limitation on the human mind in general, right? Like you can't know non-physical things. That's why you can't know God's essence. Okay, so that's one thing to the extent possible. But on a personal level, what does it mean that you have to know, understand, and verify everything with your own mind to the extent possible?
Maybe that we all have so many like biases based on our society and our experiences, which
Exactly.
it's hard to
And you
overcome.
also have like certain limitations. For example, I don't, I mean, I don't mean this to insult anybody, but I don't think anyone in this class is going to become a Navi, including myself, you know, like, so we're never going to get the level of knowledge of Nevuah, you know, of that a Navi can get. And we're probably not going to be a Rabbi Akiva either. So your goal, so we're trying to basically like maximize our potential to know and understand everything that we can. And also there are certain time periods where like, let's say like in the time of Rabbi Akiva, they didn't have knowledge of science, so there was no way to prove the creation of the universe by studying the universe. You know, Rabbi Akiva had to rely on Torah for that, you know, or on philosophy. We are in a scientific era, so we have the ability to verify something in a way that he couldn't. You know, so you're limited by your age as well. You know, you're the age of humanity you're in. Okay, any questions on this so far? This is like the foundation. Okay, so when push comes to shove, and this is really where rationalism expresses itself. Okay, and I'm going to express it again. I'm trying to express it in an exaggerated way. Okay, so the Masoret HaMachshava, the tradition of Jewish thought, meaning all of the teachings about Jewish philosophy throughout the ages, is the starting place of our research and is where we must turn at every step in our investigation. Now, if rationalists are so intent on like understanding everything with your own mind, why would they say that you have to start with the Masorah?
Maybe because God did give us this like, I guess, step.
Okay, number one, God gave us ideas. That's definitely true. Okay. And why else should you study all the thinkers of the past?
To learn because they had ideas. True.
Yeah, is
I
they
mean,
were
too.
thinkers and they had ideas that were true, and so you should learn from them. So to not do this would be irrational. And by the way, if you ever want to insult a rationalist, the worst thing you could say to them is you're being irrational. Okay, no rationalist wants to be irrational, right? So if they were to ignore the Masorah, that would be totally irrational. Like if you said, oh, it'd be like if a scientist said, instead of like relying on all of the experimental data and theories, I'm gonna start from scratch. That would just be stupid, you know? Okay. However, and this is the push comes to shove, if you find a contradiction between your intellect and the Masoret HaMachshava, then you must use all of the resources at your disposal, your mind, the minds of other thinkers, meaning like your Rebbeim and the other Chachamim, and all of the sources within the Masoret HaMachshava in an attempt to resolve this contradiction. Okay. But at the end of the day, if you cannot resolve the contradiction, then you must go with your own mind, or at least say, I don't know how to make sense of what the Baal and Masorah are saying, but I can't go against my mind. Okay, and I'll give you a couple examples. I thought about including examples for every point that I make in the PowerPoint, but I realized it would take too long. So I'm just going to give you a couple of verbal examples. So one example of this, I think I mentioned earlier in the year that the Ralbag had a couple controversial opinions. You know, everyone in Judaism, except the Ralbag maybe, holds that God created the universe yesh me'ayin, out of nothing. Okay, but the Ralbag held that that was impossible. Okay, so he held that didn't make sense, and he was aware that he was disagreeing with many other chachamim, but he said, I have to follow my mind. You know, less controversial example, the Rambam said that, you know, a lot of Chazal held by astrology, you know, that the stars influence our behavior, and the Rambam held that scientifically we know that that can't be true. And he says at one point in the commentary on the Mishnah, he says like you know, I'm aware that there are many chachamim, maybe even all of them, who believe in this, but like it doesn't make sense to me. And then I'll give you an example from this year. I think this was our second Friday seminar. I gave a shiur on whether the Mabul at the time of Noah was global or not, whether to cover the entire earth. And clearly all of the Chachmei HaMasorah, up until like the 1800s, held that the flood covered the entire earth. And I gave my reasons for why I think it's impossible to say that. And I'm not saying that they made a mistake. I'm saying that they didn't know of the impossibilities. So I have no choice. I cannot believe that the flood was global, So that's when push comes to shove. Okay. All right. What's the view of Gedolim? So Gedolim are Chachamim. Okay. They're great Chachamim, and you have to treat their statements as statements of Chachamim, which means you don't read them superficially. You analyze them on the deepest level. You're intellectually honest. You make sure that you think into them very deeply. You ask other Chachamim. So you don't just look at them superficially. And the rationalists would say, if you think that an average person is greater than Rashi and Ramban and the Rambam, that's just arrogant. Even Ramban didn't think he was greater than Rashi. You don't think that you're greater than them because these are great Chachamim and we have evidence of it. And for this reason, if you think that you spotted a glaring question or problem that they missed, that's also in most cases going to be arrogant and foolish. If you're a 12th grader, okay, and you see a problem, you see a contradiction in the Rambam, and you're like, I beat the Rambam. That's just arrogant. If you could see it as a 12th grader, then the Rambam definitely could see it as a experienced thinker. Okay. However, there's one mistake, there's one exception to this. What type of problem might you discover in the Mefarshim that they didn't discover, and it wouldn't be arrogant for you to say that?
Something that changed based on science?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So if the problem stems from facts that they were unaware of, which is usually going to be in science, so then it's not arrogant to say that they didn't know about this. Again, for example, there used to be a belief that was widely accepted until I don't know when, called spontaneous generation, that they believe that flies, let's say if you had a piece of meat that was left out and people saw maggots in the meat, they thought that the dead matter of the meat was turning into maggots. They just didn't realize that there were eggs that were being laid that were smaller than the human eye can perceive them. So this had ramifications. They thought that things could just spontaneously generate. We now know that that's false, but it's not due to any fault on their part. Okay. Now, speaking of which, rationalists realize no human being is infallible. It is possible for a gadol to be mistaken, misinformed, or ignorant on a particular matter or subject, and that would not diminish his godless. It wouldn't diminish his greatness. In fact, what makes gadolim great is the fact that they followed their minds. So it is possible to make mistakes, and you'll see this all over in the Mefarshim. There will be times when the Abravanel will disagree with the Ralbag, and there will be times when the Ralbag says when the Abravanel says the Ralbag is making a big mistake. Or let's say the Rambam. The Rambam says, I forgot the exact number, but he says the Rif, and this is in halakha commentary, but it's still principle here. The Rambam says the Rif only made 3 mistakes, but the Rambam disagrees with the Rif on hundreds of issues, dozens of issues, but he says he only made 3 mistakes. So it is possible for Gedolim to make mistakes. It's just, if you're very quick to say that, then that's really arrogant and foolish. Okay, so that's my initial presentation of the rationalists, and we're gonna go through the traditionalists and blind faith, and then we're gonna pit them against each other. Okay, so any other questions on the rationalists for now?
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry. And I'm not sure if that comes into push comes to shove category. What would the rationalists say to, when tragedy strikes? I mean, I would kind of, because I feel like that's a very, that's a point of differentiation between all of them.
Yeah, so the way I view it, that's not part of the school of thought. That's more of what is their view on that particular subject. And you could have overlap. You could have rationalists and traditionalists both holding the same position on how to deal with tragedy or on what that says about God. I don't think that's what I'm talking about with the schools of thought is more of how you approach the teachings within Jewish philosophy in within Jewish philosophical tradition. And so I think you're asking about a topic within a particular topic within Jewish philosophical tradition, not how they approach such topics in general, if that makes any sense.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Leah, did you have a question?
No, I answered my own question.
Okay. All right. Traditionalists. So notable traditionalists include Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, otherwise known as the Kuzari, and the Ramban. Rashi, I think, would be counted as that. Rashba was a traditionalist, but more on the rationalist side, okay, like, but traditionalist, and Rav Hirsch. And by the way, Rav Hirsch says that the two model traditionalists are the Kuzari and the Ramban. That's who he views as like the two model ones. And then Rav Hirsch criticized the Rambam's rationalism. So he makes it like a war between the Rambam and then the Kuzari and the Ramban. Okay, their standard of Emunah is to understand and trust in the Masorah HaMachshava, in the tradition of Jewish thought, as taught by the Baalei Masorah, as our only means of connecting to what Hashem gave us at Sinai. Meaning, Hashem taught us the Torah and taught us these ideas, and they were passed down through the Masorah, and our goal is to understand all of the ideas that were taught, because that's the closest thing we can do to get to what God gave at Har Sinai. Okay. And what are we trying to do? And this is not so much different than what I just said, is to know, understand, and master the contents of the Masorah HaMachshava. And this is analogous to halacha. For example, in halacha, we know that we're not getting, the Torah was only given once. We're not getting any new halachos, okay? And everything that God gave is in the Masorah. And yeah, machlokas came up, and like we lost some things, and some things are subject to disagreement. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn all of the contents of the halachic Masorah, and what they're doing is trying to learn all the contents of the hashkafic Masorah, of the philosophical Masorah, as best as possible. Okay. When push comes to shove, this is where the difference is between the traditionalists and the rationalists. Okay, so the traditionalists hold the Masorah HaMachshava is the arena which defines the limit of our conclusions, which means you do have to try to understand the Masorah HaMachshava to the best of your ability, but you must ultimately rely on it, even if it doesn't make sense to you or if it clashes with your personal beliefs and feelings. Okay, and we are bound to the conclusions of the Baalei Masorah in this area, not necessarily as psak, because I don't think they would hold that there's, I mean, maybe some of them do, but I don't think they'd hold there's psak in philosophy. But it means, like, practically speaking, like, those are the only valid positions. Those are the only legit positions if they're taught in the Masorah HaMachshava. Okay, and that's going to be clarified by this next point. The review of Gedolim. Gedolim are Chachamim, and their authority in matters of Machshava is binding. Even if we don't understand the truth of their positions, and even if we disagree, we still have to accept the conclusions. It doesn't mean they're infallible, although I have met some traditionalists who do think that Chazal cannot make mistakes, but I don't think that that's the predominant view. But even though they can make mistakes, we are not on the level to make that judgment. And that's the key point here. And when there is a clash between our minds and the minds of the Chachamei HaMasorah, we must always assume that it is our minds which are deficient. Okay, and I'll give an example of this, all right? And this is an example of the difference between the Ramban and the Rambam, okay? So the Rambam, and people will argue with what I'm about to say, Rambam does not hold by Gehenom, okay? He holds by an event called Gehenom, like in Yemos HaMashiach, but he does not hold by like a place called Gehenom where the souls are purified and purged and, and prepared for Olam Haba, okay? He doesn't write about this in any of his books and doesn't mention it. He would mention it if it were important in like Hilchos Tshuva or, other stuff like that. So why doesn't he hold by it? And neither does the Ralbag, by the way, okay? Why not? Because according to them, it can't be true. Based on the way they understand what the soul is and what knowledge is and how reward and punishment works, it can't be true, okay? So the Ramban, one of his main arguments about why he does hold by Gehenom is Chazal talk about it all the time. There are tons and tons of teachings of Chazal that talk about Gehenom, And the Rashba, the Ran, who is also a, I would say is a traditionalist, okay, here's what he says. He makes the Rambam's argument, okay, and he understands where the Rambam's coming from, but then he says what Chazal teach, and then the Ran says, look, Chazal teach it, it must work somehow, and we don't know how, and if we try to figure it out, we probably won't be able to figure it out, So it's a question of when push comes to shove, what gives? Is it what your mind says, or what the Chachamei HaMasorah say? If you're in a position, let's say like the Ralbag, and you come to this conclusion that Yesh Me'ayin doesn't make sense, are you going to go with that, or are you going to say no? Chazal have said Yesh Me'ayin all this time, and like I must be missing something, And obviously that's a very, very tough judgment call. Like, at what point do you say that, but the traditionalists draw the line. And someone, when I was talking about this with the yeshiva guys, someone made the statement last night. The Chachamei HaMasorah, sorry, the rationalists view the Chachamei HaMasorah as the starting point and as like great thinkers, but the traditionalists view it as the starting point and the finish line, and that's why I was using the word the arena. The arena of Jewish thought is all Jewish thought occurs within these positions here. Okay. Okay, so that's what I want to say about traditionalists for now. Obviously, we're going to pit them against each other, and it'll become clear.
Can I ask a
Yeah,
question about that? Oh,
Yeah.
go first.
No, I'll go ahead.
Okay, so what if there's contradicting views within them? Then like we could accept both of them as right?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? So let's take a classic example of Olam Haba, right? The Rambam holds that it's non-physical, the Ramban holds that it is physical. So what would a traditionalist do? Traditionalists would say you should strive to understand both positions as much as possible, but who are we to decide in favor of the Rambam against the Ramban or vice versa? Meaning you might be drawn to a certain thing, but if you are intellectually honest and humble, you'll say like, I don't know. Like, I don't know which one is true because I'm not as great as the Ramban or the Rambam.
And how would that like differ from the rationalists? Or
so the rationalists would say that the rationalists would certainly could be in that position, like I'm trying to understand it, but I can't decide and I'm at an unknown. But the rationalists would, I think, be more prone to saying like, yeah, the Ramban doesn't make sense to me, and I think he was wrong. Like, what he's saying made sense in his framework into him, and like I can understand where he's coming from, but he's wrong. And I don't think traditionalists would be as quick to say that. Yeah, Tamar?
That actually addressed my question.
Okay, good. And I don't mean to rush also, but I do want to get to the I think maybe what we should do, since we only have like 15 minutes, is let me you can ask questions on like what I'm gonna do the presentation, then we'll save questions for afterwards in case people have to go. Okay, blind faith. And again, this one I don't know very well, and it is new. Okay, so some notable blind faith adherents, remember this is very recent. Some Hasidic Rebbes, not all of them. For example, Chabad is not like this. Ger Hasidim are not like this. I've heard that the Bnei Yissaschar, the Moonkatcher Rebbe, is like this. I get the impression that Rav Nachman of Breslov and Breslov Hasidus is like this. There's an author, a contemporary author, Rav Shlomo Arush, who wrote The Garden of Emunah, who was like this. You've seen bumper stickers that say, I'm a Pasher to Yid, I'm a simple Jew. Like, that's like the mentality we're talking about here, okay? A simple, unquestioning faith, okay? And their standard of Emunah is simple, unquestioning, unsophisticated faith, which stems from within. And this is most evident from stories that they tell, where they will often tell stories that glorify the simple Jew or the child, the person who is just not questioning at all or doesn't have doubts, and that's the level that we're trying to achieve, to have the purest, simplest degree of faith where it is untouched by any doubt or any or complexities or anything like that. It's purity, okay? And I'm sure you've heard people give speeches like this. I mean, I remember hearing this as a teenager in Jewish high school, of like people arguing against the need to prove God's existence by saying, how do you know that your father is really your father? Have you done a DNA test to verify it with your own mind? Are you relying on what other people told you? No. You know in your heart that he's your father, and you don't need to rely on proofs or on people. The same is true with your Father in heaven. His children shouldn't need any proof or authority to tell us that their Father is there and that he cares about them. It's, you feel it deep within you, okay? And it comes from within, okay? What's their view of Gedolim? Now, this is something I also don't really know, okay? Again, I'm trying to say this disclaimer. I'm not familiar with the Blind Faith School. I've only seen some things here and there. There's another book, by the way, Norman Lamb, who wrote a book on Hasidim, where he will talk about this at length, but I haven't finished the book. The Gedolim are those who have achieved the highest level of Emunah and are the greatest guides for us on the path. We have to devote ourselves fully to their teachings, even to the point of self-negation, where all you're doing is just following their teachings and being in line with them. And by connecting to these Gedolim and their teachings, we connect to Hashem. Now, what does it mean to connect to them? That depends on what version of this blind faith you have. For some people it's just accepting the teachings of the Rebbe without question. For some it's like certain involvements with the Rebbe, of like spending time with him and asking for advice and guiding everything based on what he says. When push comes to shove, you have to rely on what your heart tells you. And if someone tries to sway your mind with fancy proofs and arguments, that's just the Yetzer Hara trying to lead you astray. If we had time, I'll go over some statements of Rav Nachman of Breslov saying how, like, if you're tempted to learn the more Nevuchim, that's really just like the Yetzer Hara, like to try to like pull you off the derech, Okay, now we get to the part where we can actually like understand how they interact with each other. So I phrase these as dialogues. Okay, how would rationalists talk to the traditionalists? Now they have a lot in common. Okay, so let's start off like that. I didn't start off like that here. I started off like that in the other place. Rationalists would say, knowledge is our purpose in life. Hashem endowed us with intellects. Our intellect is what differentiates us from the animals and what we have in common with Malachim. It's the whole basis of our relationship with Hashem. Okay, and I don't think traditionalists would disagree. But then the rationalists say, how could Hashem endow us with the ability to know and understand his world and his Torah and instruct us not to do so? That would be absurd. We have an obligation to use our God-given intellect to the greatest extent that reason dictates. And the traditionalists would not disagree, except maybe that last line, to the greatest extent that reason dictates. Okay. Okay. So here's another area of overlap. Does this mean that we ignore or reject or devalue the Masoras HaMachshava? Of course not. That would be irrational, and irrational is bad. The Masoras HaMachshava must be the starting place and framework for our investigation, and also our most valuable resource for Chachma. Of course, if you want to understand God, you're going to look to the Rambam and the Ramban and Rashi and all of the Chachmei Masorah. Okay. However, as your intellect develops, you are obligated to test and verify the contents of the Masoras HaMachshava with your own mind to the best of your ability. Okay, it's like that Russian proverb, trust but verify. Okay, if you are intellectually capable of verifying the Masoras HaMachshava firsthand, but you choose not to, then Hashem will hold you accountable for your negligence. Okay, in other words, it's actually against God's will if you are capable of basically getting firsthand knowledge and you don't. And the Chovos HaLevavos gives this a mashal. Okay, he says the king appoints a tax collector to collect the royal taxes and says you should personally count out the money to verify the total. If the tax collector does not count the money but relies on the testimony of others, the king will be angry about his disobedience, even if the total sum ends up being correct. So the nimshal is, yeah, you're relying on what the Chachmei Masorah taught you, but you are obligated, if you are capable, you're obligated of verifying it on your own. And even if you don't, even if you turn out to be right, God will be angry at you because you're not using your mind, and that's the whole point. Okay, and I've said this idea in the name of the Siddur, the Otzar Tfilos by Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. That the reason why it says Elokei for each one is Yitzchak didn't just rely on what Avraham taught him; he relied on it, but then used his own mind and verified it on his own and arrived at his own relationship with Hashem. Okay. Similarly, the rationalists would say, and by the way, and this is why rationalists will often go to non-Torah sources of knowledge. Okay, Rambam, Ibn Ezra, Ralbag, very into learning non-Jewish sources of knowledge because that's how you can verify, the contents of Torah. Whereas the traditionalists we'll see are not into that. Okay, the rationalists would also say if you rely on secondhand knowledge, that'll be fine as long as no one in the chain of transmission is mistaken. But if someone is mistaken, then the whole chain can be invalidated, and that's why you have to check for yourself insofar as you're capable of doing so. So here's a mashal, also from the Chovos HaLevavos. A blind man being led by a seeing man. So picture like the seeing guy, blind man has his hands on the seeing guy's shoulders, and he's being led to somewhere. So that blind guy will get to his destination, but a chain of blind men, each holding onto each other's shoulders, will only get to the destination if the person in the front can see. But if the person in the front can't see, so then they all fall off a cliff. Or if the person in front is a liar, then they all fall off a cliff, Or if one person breaks off of the chain, then they all fall off a cliff, So this argument is pointing out a pitfall, which is as long as you're relying on someone else and not seeing it with your own mind, then there's always a chance that the person is wrong. And we know that people can make mistakes, and we know that even in halacha, then there is machlokes because stuff is lost, So you're running a risk by relying on Masorah here. And that's why you have to verify if you're capable of it. Lastly, the rationalists would argue that firsthand knowledge is a higher level than secondhand knowledge. When you know something with your own mind, it's more real to you and it's impervious to doubt, okay? Because you know it for sure. But if you're just relying on authority, your mind will always have room to doubt because your argument will ultimately be like the Rambam says, and you're not actually like relating to it, on your own. When I was in high school, we got into an argument with one of our Rebbeim who was from the Mir Yeshiva, who was a traditionalist, and we were rationalists, and was arguing about hashkafah pratis. And I remember like we like intellectually cornered him and like tried to point stuff out, and he just shut down and he said, I believe this view because it's what my Rebbe taught me, and it's what his Rebbe taught him, and it's what his Rebbe taught him, going all the way back to Moshe at Sinai. And that was when I saw this guy doesn't have an argument, you know, like he doesn't have his own argument. He's just relying on authority. And he saw the questions we were posing to him, but the rationalists would say, like, if you understand with your own mind, then you're not relying on authority. You see it, you know, you don't have doubt. A muscle in Mishlaic terms would be who has greater conviction, the little kid who looks both ways before crossing the street because his mother told him to, or the adult who knows what happens when you get hit by a car. Like the kid might be tempted to run out into the street because, oh, it's just mom says don't do that, you know, but the adult has actual knowledge why you shouldn't do that. Okay. Rationalist response to blind faith is very easy. Blind faith is for fools. Faith is not a source of truth. Facts don't care about your feelings, and to reject knowledge and base our beliefs on blind faith is the opposite of Hashem's will. Self-explanatory, right? And Side Egon has some very, very like cheeky like ways of saying that. Like he says, you know, oh, you have blind faith, so take your bank account, which has no money, and just have faith that there's money there, and see if that actually like results in money. Or let's say like someone's trying to kill you, you know, just have faith that the guy doesn't exist anymore, and see if that helps. You know, his point is like faith is not an indicator of reality, you know. So that's what they would say there. Okay, traditionalist response to rationalists. Traditionalists would concede on this point. If we didn't have a Masoras HaMachshava, meaning there was no Torah Misinai, then we would have no choice but to rely on our own minds to find truth, right? So they totally agree that rationality is what makes you human, and like is you know, God's, you know, gift to us, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but we do have a Masoras HaMachshava. And seeing as how you rationalists agree that we received a Masoras HaMachshava at Sinai, why are you wasting your time trying to figure out everything on your own? Okay. And who are you to think that your attainment of truth can match the levels of the Chachmei HaMasorah? You are far better off devoting your time to understand their teachings than to try and reinvent the wheel yourself. And that's like the analogy I gave before of it would be foolish for a son. Oh, actually, I'm going to give this analogy again. Hold on. Moreover, by dabbling in non-Torah sources of knowledge, like the Rambam did, and trying to figure out things on your own, you risk falling into error and heresy because you're mixing in Torah with other stuff. And this is Rav Hirsch's big critique of the Rambam. Is Rav Hirsch said that the Rambam tried to develop Torah from without, bringing in Greek and Arabic thinking, and introduce foreign ideas into Torah. Whereas Rav Hirsch says that the Ramban and the Kuzari developed Torah from within. They didn't go anywhere outside of Torah. They developed it fully from the Masorah of Jewish thought. And the traditionalists would say it's much safer to rely on the Masoras HaMachshava. So here's a mashal to illustrate both those points. Doctors have no choice but to rely on their limited and faulty knowledge of the human body, which they gather through observation and experimentation. But if a doctor received a medical book authored by the creator of the human body, which he knew was 100% true, it would be foolish, dangerous, and a waste of time for him to rely on his own research. And the traditionalists are saying God gave us the Torah with all the truths that we need in it. So why are you trying to make recourse to stuff outside of Torah? You know, you should devote all your time to understanding what God gave us. And yeah, it's true that there might be some errors or mistakes that crept in, or there might be some doubts, but the best you can do is just devote your time to understanding all of the positions of the greatest Chachamim in our nation. You know, if you finish that, then we'll talk. You know, then like maybe there's more you can do. Then maybe you can be a rationalist in those areas that the Masorah doesn't address. But for us, stick to the Masorah. However, if you aren't able to have trust in the Masoras HaMachshava on a particular issue, and you feel that you need to make recourse to rational proofs, then go ahead, as long as you stay firmly committed to the conclusions of the Masorah. So you'll hear people like this, let's say like certain, like I've heard like NCSY advisors, the rationalists will be eager to try to come up with proofs of Torah and God, okay? But I've heard traditionalist ones who will say like, don't bother with those proofs. But then if they see a kid who like needs rational proofs, they'll be fully willing to like, okay, here's the book Permission to Receive, here's the book Permission to Believe. Like if you need that, then go ahead and do that. But really like you know, if you don't need that, then don't bother with that. You know, just focus on learning what the Torah teaches. Okay, what's the traditionalist response to the blind faith? Is faith is a virtue, okay? But rather than relying on your personal faith, you should place your faith in the Masoras HaMachshava. And I have noticed, and I can't say this for everyone, I've noticed some books written by blind faith people that you'll notice something very peculiar. They don't cite sources. They just teach teachings. Now you can argue that that's just a stylistic thing, you know, but like it feels very non-Masorah centered, you know, and like the traditionalists will root everything in the Chachamim of the Masorah, and the rationalists will either root it in the Chachamim of the Masorah or on like knowledge outside of the Masorah. You know, it's not just like teaching you like feeling based on like thoughts and feelings. You know, okay, blind faith responses. Blind faith, as you can imagine, hates rationalism. Dangerous. The more you rely on your own mind, the more you are opening the gates of heresy and the more you're weakening your faith. Again, I mentioned Rav Nachman of Breslov in his writings says that you could tell if someone has studied the More Nevuchim because they don't have a Tzelem Elokim. You could tell it by looking at them, you know, like it's like really, really bad, you know. Their response to traditionalists is obviously the Masoras HaMachshava reflects the contents of our faith, but we shouldn't need to make recourse to the Masoras HaMachshava for our belief. Our belief should be pure from within ourselves. And again, this is glorified by like, especially in the stories of like the pure child who like has a pure neshama, who like, you know, tragically died and went straight to Shemayim. Why did he go straight to Shemayim? Because he had such a pure faith in Hashem. You know, I don't think the rationalists would definitely not hold that, and neither would the traditionalists. You know, like, and that's like maybe getting what Ilana was asking about on like that. I know I'm using an example from a particular issue of When Tragedy Strikes, but I'm using that example to show that like it's not purity of feeling or belief that is virtuous. You know, it is knowledge. The rationalists and the traditionalists both hold that knowledge is really of value. But the question is like, at the end of the day, are you striving to go, are you erring on the side of your own mind or erring on the side of the Masorah? And in conclusion, and again, I'll take questions after this, but we're almost at the end of this. So the conclusion is like this. I believe it was the first year I taught this, maybe the second year. So I got to the end of this thing and a student, I'm not gonna name who it was, very well-meaning student said, but Rabbi Schneeweiss, how do I know which school of thought is right? And I answered, well, the rationalists will say whichever school of thought makes the most sense to your mind. The traditionalists would say whatever the Masoras HaMachshava teaches, that's the right school of thought. And the blind faith adherents will say, what does your heart tell you? You know, and that's what makes it a school of thought, is that this is something that is larger than particular hashkafic issues. This has to do with how you approach all of Jewish thought. And when I was going over this with the guys in yeshiva last night, and I said this anecdote, one of them said, are you saying that you can't, that your school of thought is not a choice? I'm not saying that, okay? There are definitely people who start off as traditionalists and then learn that the Masorah teaches, or they conclude that the Masorah teaches that you should be a rationalist, and then they become a rationalist. And there are people who start off as rationalists and then become traditionalists, and there are people who start off as rationalists and become blind faith, you know? So it is possible to change. But my only point here is that this has to do with how you think about what your trends of thinking are, or what your approaches of thinking are in a much more global issue. And that's why, like I said at the very beginning, I don't care if you agree with my characterization of each of these schools of thought, and I'm willing to admit that I'm wrong, but being aware that there are such schools of thought, you know, I think is important, because let's say here's another simple example, like, you know, there's a chazal that says that Yocheved was born between the borders on the way into Mitzrayim, and therefore when she gave birth to Moshe, she was very old. I forgot the exact math here, and the Gemara says it was a miracle, you know. So Ramban and Rashi accept that at face value. It was a miracle, and that's it, because Chazal said it was a miracle. Ralbag and Ibn Ezra say, well, first of all, if it was a miracle, then God would have mentioned it. Secondly, like, it would have been a greater miracle than than Sarah's birth of Yitzchak, you know. And there are certain things about the types of miracles that didn't happen at different points in history. So therefore, I can't take it literally. And like Chazal said it, yeah, they meant something else, you know. So like, I think if you're not aware of schools of thought, you'll think that that's just a particular machlokas. But what I'm saying is that stems from an overall different way of thinking, you know. Or let's say another example, the Ritva, who was a student in the chain of Masorah from the Ramban. I forgot if he actually learned from the Ramban or not. So the Ramban wrote a bunch of critiques of the Rambam, and the Ritva, who really agreed with the Ramban, was defending the Rambam against the Ramban. Okay, soap opera. All right. But the Ritva said the Ramban didn't fully understand the Rambam because the Ramban was too much involved in his own Kabbalah. Because he was involved in a Kabbalistic framework, he couldn't really see where the Rambam was coming from, So that's not just saying it was a machlokas. That's saying that there were two different ways of thinking that somehow accounted for that machlokas. So that's like the takeaway that I want you to have is that there is such a thing, when Rashi and Tosfos disagree on a halacha, that's not an overall different way of approaching all of halacha. That's a machlokas on this particular issue. And many things in Chumash and in Machshava are particular machlokas on particular issues, but there is such a thing as schools of thought. And there are machlokim that really come from that school of thought. So that's officially end of this presentation. And if you have to go, then have a good Shabbos. And if I'll stick around and answer questions for as much as there are questions.
Have a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Sure.
So according to the traditionalists, how would you say how would you define the Masoras HaMachshava?
Yeah, that is a big question. And I'll tell you why. Because they hold that the Masoras HaMachshava grows, right? That's what you're gonna say, yeah, right. So I forgot if I mentioned this. I think I mentioned this in class one day. But a friend of mine who is, based on this, I think he's a traditionalist, was saying how personally he finds the views of the Ari Zal on non-Jewish souls. He finds those views repugnant. Like he says, like it doesn't make sense. Like I guess I don't know what those views are, but something about like implying that they're less than human, or something like that. And this friend of mine said it doesn't make sense to me. But since the Ari Zal has been accepted by the Jewish community as a valid chacham and part of like the Jewish tradition, I can't disagree with him. So that struck me as weird. Like, what does that mean? Like let's say during the time of Bayis Sheni, you had Tzedukim who denied Torah Sheba'al Peh, and many Jews were Tzedukim. So like, was that a view that became accepted in the Jewish world, and now you consider it part of that, and it's a legitimate belief? Like, I don't know at what point something becomes like. There's certain things that are clear. Let's say like, I don't think anyone's going to say that like Rashi, was not a Jewish thinker, but like there are other things like like the Ralbag, is like he's printed all the Mikros Gedolos, so a lot of people now like treat him as like any other Rishon. But then people who really understand what he's saying, I think, would reject him and say like, no, that's foreign to Judaism. So that's a good question, Ayala. I don't know if it's a societal thing. I don't know if like there's certainly no like committee, that like determines who's in and who's out. I know, for example, in our yeshiva, then it seems like a lot of people in our yeshiva almost make like a blanket statement of in the same way that in the Talmud, then there's a line drawn after the period of the Tanaim, and like Amoraim can't argue with the Tanaim, and like all the views of the Tanaim are treated as like equal authority. I've seen people in our yeshiva who basically do the same thing with all the Rishonim, that all the Rishonim like are equal thinkers, and all their views are like legitimate. And like I could, that to me seems like a very traditionalist type view. It's just drawing the line there, whereas others would say, like I've also heard other of my Rebbeim who will say that certain Rishonim, just because they were in the same time period does not mean that they actually like had the right fundamentals, and made severe mistakes in Jewish thinking because of their premises that they had wrong, that they got from like false views, and like, so the answer is I don't know, but like it is a valid question, and I would, if I ever am talking with a traditionalist, like I often find myself in this position of like, who are you to like dismiss like so and so, and like and with all the people we say, oh well, he's a famous rabbi, so I have to accept him, like where do you draw the line? Like Rav Soloveitchik, like a lot of people were against his philosophy, but then when he died and published books and is now in the past, does he now become included in the club? Like, like I don't know how that works. So good question. I can't answer it really.
Also, I forgot when I asked the question before of, wait a second, actually I forgot. I'll come back.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about like the difference between rationalists and traditionalists, like in practice?
Sure.
It seems to me like someone could, think that it's worthwhile to rely on, the conclusions of your mind at the end of the day, but also not not disagree with wherever it is that they draw the line, because they don't think that they're like, smart enough to disagree with.
Yeah, exactly.
Whoever.
Yeah. So so we had to talk about this in yeshiva after shir also, that like it is a, the rationalists, especially Chovos Halevavos, emphasizes that you have to like know what your own limitations are, and not go beyond that. And so I do think that if someone said, look, I hold that a person should verify everything with their own mind, to the extent possible, but I'm just not a thinker, or like I can't reach that level of thought. So in practice, I don't think there would be any distinction between how he approaches stuff and how the traditionalist does. I just don't think there'd be anything in practice. I guess the only thing that might come up is if there's like, like undeniable, something that he himself can't deny with his own mind, like let's say, I'll give you an example. Like, let's say someone says, look, I'm not a philosopher. Okay. So like, I'm just going to accept the conclusions of Chazal. But let's say that guy is a doctor. Okay. And let's say he knows the human body really well, and he sees statements of Chazal that just are totally wrong about the human body. So what's he going to do? So like, I think if at heart he's a rationalist, then he'll say like, okay, like Chazal were wrong in that area, but I'll tell you an example. I think this example is actually illustrative of something. So Chazal makes statements about medicine and science. We now know that they're not true, okay? But even in the time of like like the Rishonim, they knew that certain cures that Chazal said don't work, okay? So the question is, what did they do with it? So I think it's Tosfos that says this. I don't know where the Tosfos is, but the Bali Tosfos said, how do they account for things in Chazal that that they said worked and don't work? They said nature changed. Now, why did they say that? Because they didn't want to say that Chazal were wrong. Okay, so they said nature changed. Now, how do I view that? I think it's wrong to say that nature changed. And I think the Bali Tosfos are wrong for thinking that nature can change, unless they meant something else, like that like, was dependent on like, climate or something like that. And the climate, but like, in other words, like they were trying to avoid saying the Chazal were wrong. And it prompted them to posit that it must be that nature changed. And maybe it's because they didn't know science, that like, they didn't realize that doesn't happen, or so, so like, I feel like the guy you're asking about tomorrow is like kind of in a position like that. At what point is he going to say, like, is he going to justify Chazal? And what point is he going to like say like, I'm sorry, like that's, I can't deny my mind,
I remember my question.
Sure.
So within the Masoras HaMachshava, right?
Yeah.
So would a traditionalist, like let's say there is a contradiction between whatever they define as the Masoras HaMachshava, two people in that.
Yeah.
Then do they hold that there's one right true from Sinai? Like there's one true Masorah?
Yeah. Oh no, so sorry, I was saying about your question. So
they do hold that there is one true Masorah from Sinai.
Or what? What was your or? Because there's different ways you could say or.
Or, well, if they do hold that, then how do they deal with the contradiction within the Masoras HaMachshava?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So, one thing that I discovered when I was giving this shir last night, which I didn't have time to factor into this presentation, is I gave a Sunday shir a couple weeks ago on Shot versus Drush, and one of the things I said was that Agadata, like non-halachic midrashim, were not given at Har Sinai. And one of the questions that was raised is, well, it might be true that midrashim, like as a genre or as particular texts, were not given at Sinai, but like, what were their philosophical ideas given at Har Sinai? And if so, what? For example, we do hold that there is such a thing as Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Breshis, that God gave a specific Masorah about ideas in physics and metaphysics that were passed down, and Rambam holds they were lost, and Ramban holds that he had them. But the question is, what was given at Sinai, and what was left to our own like extrapolation? And I think that's very wrapped up in what you're saying, Ayala. Like, do we hold that like, that these ideas of, Gehenna were given at Sinai, or do we hold that it was really Chazal trying to figure it out on their own? So So I think that is a question that complicates what you're saying. I think that it'd be very simple to say that, like, okay, let me back up. Not it'd be very simple to say. I do think it's reasonable that, for example, ideas that are necessary for mitzvos, philosophical ideas that are necessary for mitzvos were given at Sinai. For example, the idea of God's oneness. That's a philosophical idea, but it's necessary for Yichud Hashem as a mitzvah. And if you have a machlokas in the Masoret Machshava on an idea like that, like a fundamental idea, so then I guess you have to hold, if you're a traditionalist, you would have to hold that, like, somewhere along the line it got messed up, but we just can't tell which one's true. Like, we're just not capable of making that decision, And there's a statement in the Gemara about in Halacha that sometimes if you have machlokas that can't be resolved, they'll say we'll have to wait till Eliyahu Navi comes to resolve it. I feel like that's like the attitude that they would take. Is like, we've gotten as far as we can get, and we can't resolve it. And so the best we can do is just understand it and, like, realize it's a possibility. There is an extreme position, though, by the way. I'll just mention this. There's an extreme position in halacha that there are some people who believe that every machlokas was given to Moshe at Sinai. Like all of the opinions in halacha that could ever be had. And that's what, and when they say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, that these and these are the words of the living God, they don't just mean that both of them are halakhically valid. They mean literally these are the words of the living God, that God gave all the positions. And I feel like I've encountered people who say that about matters of machshava, which doesn't make sense to me, But I feel like I've heard that position that God gave both, or that these are just two sides of the same coin, Like, people do try to make it a matter of perspective. And for certain things, I could say that, I would agree with that. Let's say, like, for example, in I'm trying to think of a machlokas that you would be familiar with that is just a matter of perspective. Give me 1 second. Let's say, for example, a lot of machlokas about hashkafah, that there are people who will say that the views that appear to be different among the Mefarshim are not really that different. It's just two different paradigms, like, is God constantly involved in every single thing or not? Like, they'll try to say it's just two different ways of looking at something, like in my wolf shear, like they're all looking at the same phenomenon, but there's different models, But I feel like certain things you can't say that for. Like, I feel like you can't say that Olam Haba is both physical and non-physical, or you can't say that Kares, Rama holds Kares is you lose Olam Haba, and Rashi holds Kares is you die prematurely. Like, I feel like you can't say that that's just two different perspectives. I feel like that's actually like saying something different, or like, is there such a thing as a Jewish soul, or is there only a human soul, So that's my problem with that extremist position of, like, they, all ideas are given from Sinai.
But also, is there like an objective reality of how you should think about things? Because you can't say all of these three fundamental, like, thought patterns are true, but also you can't judge them against each other because they're each in their own framework. So you only judge it based on the framework that you're in. Right.
That's kind of like the yeshiva guy who, when I gave that anecdote, said, like, so like, you're already in a framework. It's like, are you actually even deciding about this or not? It's possible that's right, and it's possible that you can break out of it. But then you may say, like, let's say you have a traditionalist who becomes a rationalist. You might say, oh, he was really rationalist the whole time. He just didn't know it yet, Another thing I want to point out, which is not part of the main shiur, but I do think that there's another question of which stance is best for you developmentally. Okay, what I mean by that is like this. Let's say you're in your first year of yeshiva or seminary, okay? And you're learning a topic, okay? And you learn it, and you're like, what Chazal say don't make sense. My mind has my own theory. I'm just going to reject what Chazal say. We would all agree you're probably just being arrogant and foolish, okay? But let's say you've been learning for a while, and then you have a problem with what the Bali Masorah are saying, So are you better served in your development as a thinker by subordinating your mind to the Bali Masorah and saying, look, hey, this doesn't make sense to me, but I must be wrong? Or are you better served by saying, I'm going to follow my mind, and following my mind is what will make me a thinker, which will give me greater access to the Bali Machshava, Like, it's going to impact you. Like, whenever this happens, like what like your many of your mitos are like muscles that you have to like keep training. So what muscle are you exercising? Are you exercising the muscle of following your mind, or are you exercising the muscle of subordinating yourself to superior chachamim? Which one is going to get you further in terms of your development as a chacham? I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I think I got to go, but if there are other questions, as always, you know how to reach me. Okay, have a good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Bye.